Hey DCC! Everyone has an idea of what marriage looks like, but having an inaccurate image of it makes it harder to have a successful marriage. We need to understand what marriage could and should be. This series, called Marriage, the Beautiful Picture, is intended to paint a clear picture of what God intended for the union between man and wife. Now, let's dive into the Word together to learn more about what that looks like and what that means for us.
All right, so I'm going to get kind of to the point with a lot of what we're going to talk about today because we have a good amount of stuff to cover. Just to say that marriage, as we've talked about every single week, is this picture that God had a picture in mind, and his picture in mind was not just, when Adam and Eve and in the garden, that was a part of it, but that picture of marriage was actually something bigger, something better, something more grand, something more incredible, and that was Christ in the church, as Paul points out. And what he means by that is this, that when God created marriage, he didn't just have two people in mind. There was this picture that we were supposed to understand how God loves his church and how the church responds in love to God, how Jesus would say, I will do anything for you. I will die for you. I will love you, serve you. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And then in response to that, the church basically says back, God, we don't love you because we have to. We don't love you because if we love you well enough, then we're going to get into heaven. It's, God, you have already loved us in spite of our lack of lovableness. And in the midst of that, you sacrificed, you loved, you served, you died. And because you did all of that, God, we respond in love back to you. We'll do whatever for you because you did whatever for us. So what does that mean? That means the pattern of marriage is this: self-giving love, self-sacrificing love, that our marriages work to the degree that they function like the gospel in the self-giving pattern. Now, if you're here and you're single, we know we've had some folks that kind of throughout the weeks have said, well, what about the single folks? What about single folks? Let me just tell you this. Every single thing we're talking about is not exclusive to marriage, but it is at its apex in terms of tension when it comes to marriage. And of all the weeks that we've talked about, this one perhaps the most. Because this week specifically, we're going to talk about the trauma, the baggage, the woundedness, and the issues that every single one of us brings down the aisle as we walk down the aisle, or brings to the first date when we show up to the first date, or brings to the Bumble profile or whatever it is, right? Like, we all have stuff that we bring and we all have stuff that we carried in. And so as we kind of get started towards this, I kind of almost have to mention every single time that we talk about the idea of trauma, of wounds, of hurts, of all that kind of stuff, the tension between mental health and spirituality, And to me, it is one of the most tragic tensions that exist in all of Christianity. And let me tell you why. The pushback is this. Mental and emotional health is all about finding yourself. But Jesus is all about dying to self. And so how can those two things coincide? Now, I would simply say this to launch us into our discussion this morning. Galatians 2:20 is one of my favorite verses about this, because it simply says, in very clear, as Paul is talking, he says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. He says, in the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me. He gave himself up for me. Now, that whole second part, that means this life I live in the flesh, I live by faith, that I have been crucified with Christ. And so my question is simply this: how can you crucify a self you've never met? How can you crucify a self that you've never actually fully acknowledged? You see, we all have tendencies, we all have pushings, we all have things that kind of draw us and drive us to different things and ideas. And oftentimes we don't actually sit there and think, what is it that's happening inside of me? Why is it that I have such a deep need for control? Perhaps it's because my entire background, my entire childhood growing up, it was so volatile. It was so up and down. There was just so much volatility that I had to control everything that I could control. Why is it that if you're married, And some of you hear the cabinet door slam, bam. And you aren't just aware of your spouse. All of a sudden you feel shame. So I actually have a similar to last week. I've got a story. I chat GPT'd this. And honestly, the reason I'm chat GPTing stories, I'm just going to be fully transparent, is because if I told y'all the real story, y'all be like, that was my story. I'd be like, yeah, that's half of our stories. Because as I've honestly sat in tons of conversations with people who are in all kinds, and myself, been through marriage therapy and walked with people through different seasons, I'm like, these stories are really similar. So this is how our past, what happens is our past, as we have these issues, these things that we bring into marriage, that all of a sudden we hear a kitchen door slam, and we're not just feeling aware, we're not just feeling attentive. I wonder what they're upset about. Some of us, we actually feel shame. Because every time their parents were upset, they slammed the door, they stomped, and all of a sudden you don't just feel aware, you feel an internal feeling that's not actually what was stimulated by that. So here's the story. Anna, it's by our people Anna and Tim again, by the way. Anna sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the edge of her coffee cup. The morning light filtered through the window, casting a soft glow on her face. And across from her, Tim, he shuffled through the mail, but his furrowed brow was in concentration. Did you pay the electricity bill? Anna asked. Her voice tinged with more tension and anxiety than necessary. Well, Tim glanced up, a hint of annoyance in his eyes. I thought you were handling it this month. The silence settled between them, heavy and familiar. It was the kind that had begun to fill their home, growing like an invisible wall. Anna sighed, looking away. I thought we agreed I'd handle the groceries and you'd manage the bills. Tim placed the letters down, an expression softening. I know. I forgot. Work's been intense. Anna nodded, but the words felt hollow. They both knew it wasn't about the bills or the groceries. These small disagreements were echoes of a deeper, unspoken wounds. Anna carried the weight of her childhood, growing up in a home where silence was a shield and conflict was avoided at all costs. Her fear of confrontation, I love this, her fear of confrontation often left her feeling unheard, her needs buried beneath layers of accommodations for others. Additionally, she grappled with the deep-seated fear of abandonment, having watched her mother struggle alone after her father left. And Tim, on the other hand, he bore the scars of abandonment. Raised by a father who was present only in body, he learned to fend for himself, building walls so high that even love struggled to climb over. He also struggled with a constant need to prove himself, a consequence of being overlooked and underestimated throughout his youth. I almost never, in actual counseling, I almost never deal with marriage problems. At times. But the vast majority of problems that we deal with in marriage are not marriage problems. Marriage problems are stuff like, who's going to get the groceries? Marriage problems are stuff like, what kind of toilet paper do you like? You know what we deal with? People problems that we bring into marriage. Issues, unresolved issues that we bring into marriage. And here's the thing. Marriage doesn't create them. In fact, when you're married, especially when you don't hit marriage problems, you hit life problems, you hit tragedy. All of a sudden, marriage reveals them. Because anytime you're close, anytime you're in close proximity with somebody, man, there's this tendency to have my unresolved issues show up in ways that perhaps no one else saw coming. And you know what's fascinating is we don't have to look far in Scripture to find the model of this, to find the template of this in a bad way. You see, in Genesis 2, we have the first marriage. In Genesis 3, we have the first sin. And in Genesis 4, we have the first kids. And so we're going to read Adam and Eve, Ish and Ishah's first kids as they come together and as they have this. And there's this really fascinating progression of what happens. If you ever got your Bible, open up to Genesis chapter 4. Now, Adam knew his wife Eve, and if you know the Bible, you know that that's just not date night knew his wife. And she conceived, bore Cain, Genesis 4:1, saying, I have gotten a man with the help of the Lord. And again she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a worker of the ground. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel also brought the firstborn of the flock of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering. Now, if you've heard this story before, here's kind of, again, what's happening. You've got Adam, Eve, Ishah come together, have this baby. All of a sudden, he's like, I have born a man. This is unbelievable. Can you imagine maybe what she thought? She's like, man, I've been having some indigestion. I don't know what's going down. All of a sudden, like, whoa, this is a person. This person is, grows up, and Abel is raised. Cain is raised, and Cain who works the ground, and Abel who works all of the things or all of the livestock. And so one day Abel decides, I'm going to give an offering, and Cain decides I'm going to give an offering. And Cain, who's working the ground, does fruits and vegetables. He's the vegetarian of the group, and so he kind of gets some stuff together. And the wording on this basically shows that he just kind of gets what's left over. There's a level of which he's not actually offering. He's offering these things out of a stringent sense of I have to, not a joyful offering to God. And Abel does the opposite. Abel says, okay, the very best parts, the first parts, I'm offering you the first cuts and the fat portions, which for them, they were not on like a low-fat diet. That was like the luxury cut of meat for them. And so Abel, offers this great sacrifice. Cain offers this not great sacrifice. And it's not just the worth, but it's the heart behind it. And Hebrews unpacks a lot of this. But this is just to say that Abel's versus Cain's were very different categorically in how these two things were viewed by God. And the Lord had regard for Abel's offering. But for Cain, in his offering, he had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. So Cain's hurt by this. Cain says, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's fair. We don't really know exactly where and what his anger went around. Was it anger at God? Was it anger at himself? Was he frustrated? Was he disappointed? Was he saying, well, at least I offered something? We don't know, but what we do know is Cain, in this moment, feels very hurt, feels very angry about what's happening. And God speaks to him in this moment. He says this. The Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your face fallen? Now, it's interesting because God almost always gives us the capacity to identify where we are. Where am I in this, right? If you look at Genesis 3, there's, Adam and Eve. They're in the garden. They've just eaten of this fruit, of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And all of a sudden, God comes down there. They're hiding. He says, where are you? And then he says, why are you hiding? It's not because God doesn't know where they are. It's not because God doesn't know why they're hiding. And it's not because he doesn't know why he's angry. Well, why does he do that? Did you know how much power there is in acknowledging and identifying where am I? Because most of us can't do that. Said differently, most of us, we're angry and we don't know why. We're irritable and we don't know why. We're frustrated and we don't know why. We're more sad than we feel like we ought to be, and we don't know why. We look around and we think, man, my life all around me is great, and I'm sad, I'm hurting, I'm frustrated. I don't know why. Did you know basically the definition of self-awareness is to simply know what I feel and why I'm feeling that way? And many of us, we can't do that. But God, I love how he asked the question. He says, okay, can you identify where you are? He says this, he says, why are you so angry? And why has your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, in other words, here's what I want you to know. There's something that's happened that you're angry and that you're frustrated about, and you didn't do as you ought to have done, and that's causing something inside of you. And here's what I want you to know. If you don't get control of it, sin, he says, if you don't do well, it's crouching at the door. It's like this thing that's lingering. It's this hurt. It's this pain. It's this anger. It's frustration that's still there. And what's going to happen is its desire is contrary to you. It's crouching at the door. It's waiting for a time. It's looking how it's going to pounce. And its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it, with the emphasis or the kind of implication being, or it will rule over you. You need to face it, or it will face you. Cain, I know you're hurt by this. I know this is painful. I know you're wounded by this. But Cain, you've got to deal with it. You've got to be honest about it. You've got to look and say, where am I actually? Because if you don't, and if you're unaware, then the pain from the past, which is in the present, will absolutely dictate your future. The pain in the past, which is in the present, if it's undealt with, will dictate your future. Its desire is to rule over you. Now, let me say this in a different way that kind of makes sense in our experience. Our pain from our past, our woundedness from our past, said differently, it rules over us. It's like it's crouching at the door because our woundedness, if you've ever thought about this, actually drives our selfishness. Our woundedness drives our selfishness. Let me say it differently this way. You ever tried to be selfless and triggered at the same time? I mean, something's triggering you, and you try to be selfless? You know, when I was growing up, the way this works, we get this physically, but mentally and emotionally, it just doesn't feel like the dots connect for this. Growing up all the time, we played football in the street. And I don't know why, because we had a backyard. We were just like, what's the worst decision that we can make in case anybody falls? But we're like 9 and 10 years old, so of course we're like, no one's going to fall. We're way too athletic for that. And then you run around and you play, and then something happens, and I don't know if you were a in the street football type of kid, and obviously no one's wearing like pants because it's Florida. And so you run, you fall, and at some point, like you just like you don't like skin your knee like we called them strawberries. I don't know if anybody had strawberries growing up, right? But you're like running, and like the skin is gone. Like you just don't like. I still have some scars on my knees from strawberries growing up, where it was gone, right? And after what happens is at first that skin that it gets taken away, right? What happens is it starts to cover up, starts to scab up, develop that shell. And if any of you have ever had siblings, then at times they may have tried to flick your scab. Or worse, slap it. Now, when I was growing up, sometimes my sister would do that. She'd flick it or slap it. And boy, I'm telling you, you want to do something, right? Now, the first time, if I'm behaving myself, what am I going to do? When you try to slap this area that's sensitive because it's wounded, because it's still trying to heal, because it hasn't healed yet, what am I going to do? First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to try to cover it. I'm like, hey, don't slap that. You kidding me? But you know what I'm going to do? If that area that's wounded, because woundedness drives us to cover up, woundedness and our scabs and our hurts from the past, if unhealed, all of a sudden somebody hits it, somebody triggers us in marriage, something happens, and all of a sudden we don't have as much control, all of a sudden we're not communicating, all of a sudden there's more conflict, all of a sudden I've never actually been able to say truth and love. I've always said truth or I've been loved, but I've never been both of those at the same time. All of a sudden someone bangs against our woundedness and we just want to cover up and protect ourselves, or if you've ever had a sibling that successfully flicked it a couple times, what happens? After 1 or 2 times, I'm punching you. Because you're flicking my wound. I'm protecting myself. This defense isn't working. Good offense. That's what we're going to do. And that's how your spouse becomes your punching bag. Unintentionally. Because they're close. They're proximal. And they're the ones who, if anybody's going to flick your wound, they're going to flick your wound. They're going to do the thing. They're going to cause the hurt. They're going to cause the problems and the issues. You see, what happens in this is he doesn't deal with his issues, his past, his wounds, and because of that, it festers. What I think is interesting about this whole passage is the very next thing that happens. It says, and Cain spoke to Abel, his brother. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel, and he killed him. And then the Lord said, where's your brother Abel? He said, I don't know. I'm my brother's keeper. By the way, if you ever quote that, you're quoting a murderer on the wrong end. For heads up. What I think is fascinating about this story is, look at this. You have Cain, who experiences something that he says he feels hurt by. Now, whether or not that hurt is legitimate, whether or not that hurt is just, what is important in this story is that he feels hurt. And that hurt, as it festers, it does eventually control him in such a way that it impacts someone who did nothing to him. Someone who did not hurt him. What did Abel do in this story? All Abel did was like, man, I love God. I love God. I'm just going to give this to God. God, I have this. This is the livestock that I have, and I'm going to offer you the very best parts of it. But because he felt wronged in this area, and maybe he felt competitively slightly outdone, but Abel, frankly, had done nothing to Cain. Abel, we have no conversation, no interaction, no see, my gift is better. All of a sudden, Cain just kills his brother Abel. Because what happened in the past doesn't stay in the past. It's in our present, and it will determine our future. And it always does. It does over and over and over and over and over. Again, our wounds from the past manifest themselves in our present, and they will drive our future. And let me just press on this one more time. Because some of us, when we hear this, the reality is you know, like, the big significant wounds that maybe you have in the past. You're like, man, I know categorically, here are the things. But when I started unpacking stuff in therapy, this was the most helpful, incredible thing that I have, one of the more life-changing things outside of Jesus and marriage that I've done, is begin to unpack this. Because all of a sudden I realized there's this guy named Carl Jung who said this quote, until we make the subconscious conscious, it'll drive our lives and we'll call it fate. You know what I realized as Christians? Until we make these subconscious drivers conscious, it'll drive our lives and we'll just call it God's will. I don't know why I always choose that type of a guy. I don't know why I always choose that type of a girl. I don't know why I always pick somebody bad for me. I don't know why I always pick somebody with that particular type of dysfunction. You want to know why? The why is somewhere in what has happened and what's going on and how you're conceptualizing what you're seeing, whether it's just the smaller absences, the smaller hurts. You see, said differently, our woundedness, excavating this, is just saying, how has your brokenness impacted my brokenness? And how has my brokenness impacted your brokenness? Because when we come to marriage, what actually happens is those issues and areas, they seem justifiable because they make sense to us. And here's the most difficult part about it. In fact, I've got an illustration that we used to go a little while ago, and we're going to do it one more time because this was the thing that when I heard this, it massively shifted how I understood these things. I'm hoping in about a minute or so somebody's going to walk out of that curtain with an illustration. Okay, well, we'll see what happens. Well, I'll go get it. I'll take it back. I'll be right back. You guys talk amongst yourselves for half of a second. Oh, perfect. You guys are going to see why I couldn't just have this up there. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the pick and pull. Y'all think that's going to, let's see how that, y'all are so nervous. See, what's happening inside of you right now? Rate your anxiety, 1 to 10. $50 as it falls. All right, we'll see. All right. There we go. I feel good about this now. I felt good about the last one, frankly. So I was in therapy, and this is what my therapist said. He said, Ben, I want you to think about this. Because every time we try to go back and excavate something in the past, it's difficult for you, it's uncomfortable for you, because you have to embrace difficult things that have happened to you, which, by the way, the reason we don't want to do this isn't because we don't know it's helpful, it's because of the fact that we know it's going to be hurtful and painful. If you've ever said, what good is talking about it? What hurt is talking about it? You realize there's literally no cost to it. There's only upside benefit. It's the most basic idea of investment that you would invest in. Anyways, so we're talking about this. And he said, basically, every time we talk about something from your past, the thing is you need to think about this in the physical sense. If you had a car and somebody just dented your door, right? Now let's say that person hated you. They hated everything, like when they backed up, they knew that it was your car, and they backed up, and they saw it, and they were going to try to do something that was just going to annoy you, was going to frustrate you, was going to hurt you. And so what they did is they backed up, and they just went bam, and ran into you. And when they did, they drove off, tires screeching, and they just went. He said, now do you have a dent in your door? And I said, yeah, of course. He said, I want you to imagine that instead it's somebody that you love, somebody that you care about, somebody who, in fact, loves you, cares about you. And you know that they have your best interest in mind. You know, in fact, they would never do anything to hurt you intentionally. You know, in fact, that though they are wonderful, they are great, they love you, they would never do something intentionally to hurt you. But as they're backing out and they accidentally hit your door, they don't even realize it. Because there's so much going on in their car, by the way, that they're trying to manage the chaos because kids are going nuts and things are happening and all kinds of stuff is swirling around and life gets crazy, life gets chaotic. And sometimes our brokenness impacts somebody else's brokenness and bam, all of a sudden there's conflict and there's issues and all of a sudden, bam, there's issues and things that we're dealing with in life. And here's what he said. If you know that someone loves you, that they wouldn't have done that to you on purpose. If you knew that they love you, they wouldn't have done it to you on purpose, and they didn't even know about it, then you pretend like there's not even a dent in your door. But let me ask you this. If someone who loves you accidentally ran into your door and they pulled off, what do you have? It's a dent in the door. Can I tell you this? Those of you who have had very non-traumatic backgrounds, this is arguably more important for you because you think the things that you came into marriage with are all right because that's the way they were done for you. That is, by the way, why the Bible talks about leaving and cleaving. Leaving what was behind, leaving background, leaving parents, and cleaving to this new marriage. What happens to most of us is we can explain why that person dented our door. We're convinced that person loves us. We're convinced that person needs it or didn't mean to. And because of that, we have all of these dents from all of these backgrounds that are festering in our lives, that are manifesting themselves in our marriage. They're things of anxiety. They're things of abandonment. They're things of control. They're things of directness, of harshness, of anger. These are all of these things. And so here's my entire point with this entire sermon. That Jesus died for this entire thing. He died for every dent. He died for every ding that was done to us and that we've done to other people. He loves us. He forgives us. And as we were going through and run through, there was this. I think Shannon was saying, like, man, I just want to make sure this thing centers around Jesus. And it was such a good point. And it made me think about, man, where does Jesus enter into this equation? And where I think Jesus actually enters into this equation is that we have the willingness, ability, and capacity to not allow this to master us because of the fact that we've identified and acknowledged it. You can't die to a self you have never met. And perhaps what's actually driving us are these dents, these dings, these woundednesses. And the truth is Jesus has made us whole, has forgiven us. We are justified before God. But in my experience, these are dents and dings that until we realize I need to bring this and crucify this piece of my flesh, it'll drive our lives. And we'll call it God's will. We'll wonder why we don't have a better marriage. And it's because you triggered me. I triggered you. And I didn't even know I had a dent there. But that frustrates me every time you do it. It makes me mad every time you do it. And I react every time that you do it. And I say it this way every time that you do it. But if Jesus died for it, then can I tell you this? Almost every area I'm willing to not confront is an area I'm willing, or I'm actually believing internally, that perhaps I'm unlovable. Perhaps if they actually deal with that, perhaps if I deal with that issue, then I really will think I'm broken. And you are. So am I. There's a couple things I want us to do, but I just want to give you one very transparent example I'm going to take it out of marriage for a second. Only because I think transposing is going to be helpful. So I told you guys before, I grew up with a somewhat of a chaotic background. I grew up with a mom who was an alcoholic who basically, at a young age abandoned our family. She was around, but, not in a meaningful, responsible way. Gone for days, weeks, months at a time. My dad did the best he could to fill in gaps, and he had such great intentions and such great heart, and, he was doing the best he can, I truly believe. But at the same time, sometimes, we do the best we can. We still don't get all the answers right on a test. And sometimes in parenting children, you do the best you can, but you still don't get it all right. And he just wasn't around as much as he ought to have been. And so what I realized was this. The best way to make my life best is to make sure your life is best. In other words, I can control me. I can control the volatility, the craziness. I know the stress. I know the weight. I know all the issues that I could carry. But what I can't control is you. And so what I actually do is I try to help you. I try to serve you. By the way, it's why my love language is acts of service. And you guys might not have realized this, but at times service and helpfulness is the kind side of controlling. And so I would try to control you by helping you and serving you and loving you. Well, so what that also means is after a while, the best thing for me is to not be about me, it's to be about you, which means that when things get about me, I get very uncomfortable. This is the level to which these things, I just want to show you how deep this stuff can go. You see, the problem with that is, I don't know if you guys know this, but my job's on a stage. It creates some tension for me. But when we're here on a Sunday morning, internally, it's all about you. I'm here, man. I just want you to see this. I want you to see how if we don't deal with our past, it absolutely creates and manifests itself in our present, and it will dictate our future just like what happened to him. And that's what it's all about. But you know what happens in the life of a church in 2024? You put things on social media. And if you go back historically and look at our church, go back a couple years back, things like that, and you could do this if you want to. Almost every time there was a sermon posted to me, not every time, but most every time. You know what I'd do? I'd go on there and make some type of a small sarcastic comment. That dude needs to brush his hair. Good point. Stuff just picking, making fun. But you want to know why? It was because internally, I'm uncomfortable with the attention. Full transparency. Because when things become about me, I become very uncomfortable. But what I realized was this, that with this season of my life where God has me with the gifts that he's given me, what that actually means is I can push away from the platform that God is putting me on. And dying to self in this moment is the realization that left to myself, without excavating this past, without seeing that, what I actually think and how I actually justify that is I want to be a humble pastor. I don't want to be the pastor who's let's put this and let's post this and let's drop it on social, and everybody's like, oh, this person has all the answers. We need to go to that church because apparently that's where the communicators go, and that's the church that we need to be in because they have all the answers. And there's something inside of me that hates that. And so I justify a false sense of humility because it just puts attention on me, as opposed to saying, I have been crucified with Christ, and God, you can do whatever you want with my life. The reason why it was difficult for me to raise prices, and when COVID hit, prices were going through the roof, we knew we needed to go from a 16 to a 14-ounce pack of our sausage. By the way, if I just switch that transition, you're like, what are we talking about? Bivocational, okay, so. Can I tell you this? I think it's the smartest thing that you can do for your business. It's called cognitive optimization. If you have ever fallen to a recency bias, a sunk cost bias, then you can be sure that you have probably fallen avoid to, maybe at some point, an anxious avoidancy bias. And so you have a difficult time confronting your direct reports. It's the same thing. It hits every area of our life, and I realize the reason I am kicking these big, important business decisions down the road is because actually in doing it, I know it's going to create margin, I know it's going to be the wisest business decision, but I feel selfish because it makes my life best, not your best, and so I will do bad decisions or kick them down the road until this is what happens to me internally. All of a sudden, I realize, wait a second, I have to make this decision because we're in trouble if I don't. And now I'm not doing it because I want to. I'm doing it because I have to, which erodes self from that. In other words, I'm not doing it because of the fact that it's this wise business decision. I'm just doing it because of the fact that I have to survive. And that feels defensible for me. Now, if that impacts how I interface with our church on social media and how I price our sausage, do you think that impacts my marriage? And do you think that impacts how I parent my kids? Because the volatility from the past creates maybe controlling in the present, which creates helicoptering in the future. The abandonment from the past creates avoidance in the present and creates separation in the future. Here's 3 things I want you to do to identify this. If you're sitting here and you're like, okay, I'm not even sure what do I do with this? Number 1, remember, woundedness drives selfishness. Woundedness, when somebody flicks that wound, you have a disproportionate reaction that they flicked any other area of your body which doesn't have a wound. And so if you're here and you're thinking, man, I really want to do something with this, but I don't really even know where to start. I don't even have the awareness to know what are those things. Here's what I want you to do. Ask the person next to you. Ask the person who knows you best and is going to be honest with you. What are the things that I have a disproportionate reaction to? What are the things that when you see it happens to everybody else, they're okay, but for me, it's elevated. For me, I get more angry. For me, I get more sad. For me, I get more quiet and I get more shut down. What are the things that you see in me that have a disproportionate reaction? Because that means there's something that's triggering that underneath. The second one is this, and this is probably the most helpful thing, is sometimes we don't know what's triggering us, but we can feel something. And when you feel something, it might be that you're angry. I want you to, number 1, when you realize you're feeling, if you're not the person that feels something very much, what that means is you don't feel bad things very much. You just feel, this is my story. I'm like, I don't feel that much. What that just meant is I just felt angry sometimes. That's a feeling. And so I started to work through this exercise. Trigger, feeling, meaning. Trigger, feeling, meaning. What do I feel angry? Why do I feel angry? Well, because I thought she was going to pay the bills. And when she didn't, and she saw that I didn't pay the bills, the trigger was she asked about it. The feeling was anger. And why do I feel angry? Well, anger is oftentimes the feeling of unjust. And I feel like I'm not really being fully seen, really fully valued, because I have so much on my plate and I'm overwhelming. And here's this small task, and I feel like I'm a complete failure to you because of that. And so what's the trigger? You asked about the bills. What's the feeling? Anger. And what's the meaning behind that? Overwhelmed, frustrated, unseen, and I feel isolated. And I feel like you don't see that. And the beauty of that is that actually reverse engineers how you're supposed to communicate it. In other words, instead of saying, I thought you were going to pay the bills. Well, I thought you were going to pay the bills. Well, I'm tired. I'm overwhelmed at work. Well, so you don't think I have anything on my plate? Well, of course you have stuff on your plate, but I have stuff on my plate. Well, what about this? Well, I thought you were going to do it. Well, I thought you were going to do it. Well, I thought you know me. It's just so much helpful if someone says, hey, I know you did not mean it this way, but I just need you to know that when you asked that question, man, it just made me feel angry. And I know that you didn't mean it that way, but it makes me feel like I'm a failure because I have so much going on. That thing, I know it's important to us, but let me just tell you, what I heard from that is that I am a failure. I am not managing my responsibility at the house, and I'm not a good husband because of it. And I feel unseen and isolated. And I know that you didn't mean any of that, but I just want you to know that when that happened, that's what I felt, and that's why I felt it. That's the meaning behind it. You know how much better of a way to solve conflict? Because I'm not even saying you did anything. I'm saying this is what happened, this is what I felt, and this is the meaning. And then somebody else says, oh my gosh. But here's the gospel. You will never be okay with that level of brokenness. You will never be okay with digging into your past. unless you realize the only reason that we are okay as people is in light of our brokenness, Jesus died for us. And so this is not me saying to my spouse, I have to be good enough. This is not me saying to God, I have to be good enough to eliminate all of this brokenness. This is me saying to God, you have already died for that. You have already loved. You have already served. You have already came down to the planet, forgiven everything that I have done. I have given you my life. I've given you my heart. I've given you my soul. And so God, I know that it is okay to be broken. And I know that in my brokenness, it is okay to move towards holiness. And that's the process of sanctification. Removing broken places in my life that Jesus has died for so that they no longer master me. And two people that get this, it's this beautiful picture of marriage. We're running a little bit late, and I do want to tell you one more story, even though I told you we're going to land this plane like 5 times. But let's kill the last song. Well, you stay up here, Danny. You're doing a good job, man. Every once in a while, you get this right. I just thought I want to end by telling you a story about a time that we got it right. And we don't get it right every time, but so often in series like this, like here's the junk, here's the things, here's where we got this wrong. On Friday, I was driving home. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And Lindsay had called, and so I called her back as I was on the way home. And I'm talking to her, and she's, where are you? And I'm saying, where are you? And we're going to go pick the kids. We had an idea to pick the kids up early on Friday from school. And I had this idea. It was awesome to me. I was like, okay, I'm going to surprise her. She's going to go pick the kids up. I'm going to go get flowers for her. And she's going to come home and she's going to be like, oh, my husband, you know? So we're on the phone. Things have been stressful for her. Things have been stressful for me. We're both aware that in each other. We're both aware and constantly kind of looking, saying, what do you need? What do you need? What do you need? And as I'm driving home, I'm saying, okay, why don't you go get the kids, and I will just meet you guys at the house. Hang up the phone, and I have this realization. Wait a second. My brokenness wants me to make sure that she's okay. But the way that I'm supposed to do that as a husband is not out of my sense of what helps me, because you want to know what actually helps me? My gifts. Part of my parents' divorces, my parents also showered us with gifts, and so in the middle of difficulty, gifts make me feel good, and so giving you gifts makes me feel good too. Hang up the phone, right in my house, right near our neighborhood, to go to the grocery store. And I called Lindsay back, and I said, hey, this is going to ruin the surprise, but my love language is gifts. Yours is quality time. I was about to go to the store and get you flowers. I know that telling you this kind of ruins this whole thing. But I realize that I'm about to love you in a way that I love to be loved. And so would you rather me get you flowers, or would you rather me come home so we can go to the store together? She said, thank you so much for asking that question. I would so much rather you be with me and go pick up the kids together than to do that separate. And there was a part of me, and I'm like, yeah, but she probably wouldn't. You know, like, but you don't see the flowers that I'm about to get. So I was, inside of me, I'm telling you, there's something inside of me that just wanted to be like, do what I want to do anyways, even though it was for her. And so I just said, okay. And so she said, well, I'm going to come pick you up at the house. I'm like, well, I'm not at the house. And she's like, I'm driving to the house. And I was like, how do you know I'm not at the house? She's like, well, I'm on the way to the house. And so we were like, it was this weird conversation. I don't know if you ever end a conversation. She's like, I don't know what's going on, but I'm going to go home. So I go home. And it was the most beautiful thing. I get home after having realized I'm about to love her in a way that I just want to be loved, and I'm putting myself aside and loving her in that way. Little did I know, the night before we had gone on a date night, and I had seen this piece of art, which if you know me, that's not really my thing. But I saw this piece of art, and I'm like, man, I am just captured by this thing. I go home, and after her therapy session, she had went and she had bought that piece of art, and she comes home and she says, you know what? You work hard. You do a ton. And you don't ever buy anything for yourself. So I got you this painting. Her awareness of herself, her awareness of her past, her dealing with that, my dealing with that. We don't get it right every single time. But I'm telling you, I have to know myself, and I have to know in that moment, in that car, dying to self, because this is what I want, and this is what I want is to bring you this gift, and why I want it is because that's how I feel loved, because at critical times in my life, that's how I was loved. But I had to put that sense of self to death, because I'm only going to love you how I want to be loved. And if I would have done that, you know what I said when I came home? I'm so glad I didn't give you that gift. You know how much that gift would have been awful compared to this painting? I'm going to give you like 3 flowers. You have this beautiful 4x4, canvas. This is incredible. Here's my point. The gospel, our ability to say Jesus has healed it, our ability to lean into the reality that he has already saved us from it. And so now we just say, where have other people's brokenness, right or wrong, impacted my brokenness, and how am I going to carry that brokenness into the future? Because God, you've already died for it. So now I'm inviting you in to come and heal it, and I have to first start by healing it by acknowledging it, that it's there. What are the hurts, the hang-ups, the heartaches in the past, that someone has left a dent or a ding in your door, and maybe they didn't mean to, but the best thing that you can offer to your current marriage, or if you're single, the best thing that you can offer to your future marriage is to deal with it. And that fear that you feel is exactly why you should. Allow the Holy Spirit to come in your life, in your heart, and excavate those things. Let's pray. God, I ask and I pray that you would give us the wisdom to see these hurts, hang-ups, that you would give us the ability to deal with them. That like Cain, we wouldn't just allow these things. It's like this tiger. It's like this lion. It's at our door, and it's about to pounce, and it wants to destroy us. But God, I pray that you would take that. I pray that you would take the hearts, the hurts, the hang-ups. I pray that you would take the trauma, that people would begin to see those things. Ask somebody around them, what are the things that you see in me? They would begin to feel the feelings that they're feeling and say, why is this driving me? This is the trigger that I'm seeing. This is the feeling that I'm feeling. This is the meaning. And then even be able to dive in and say, now where does that meaning come from? Where's the first time I felt that? Or maybe they unpack that with a therapist. But I pray, God, that the way that sin and brokenness has dinged us would not reign and rule over us. But Jesus, since you died for us, that we would be people who are mature, complete, not lacking anything, having pulled out the dings and the dents from the trials in our lives that have made us mature and have made us complete, God, that we would just love you, serve you, our marriages would look like you. And at every single moment and area of our lives where we feel this sense of relational selfishness, would we see you, King Jesus, and how you died for us, restored us, redeemed us. You're making all things new, including us. And so, God, I pray that our past, which has been crucified, that Jesus, you define our present. And we go into the future faithfully loving you and serving you with the selfless pattern of your gospel. And it's in your name, Jesus, we ask this. Amen.